I believe our first question is, are the UK criteria for diagnosing death sufficient for moral certainty? And I think that there's another question going to come immediately after about the withdrawal of treatment. So I think this question has probably been provoked by the current news story surrounding Archie Battersbee. So I'm going to kick off with a few words about the first part of the question. Are the UK criteria for diagnosing death sufficient for moral certainty? And I suppose in a word, in a time when politicians don't like giving quick one-word answers, if I had to, I would say no. But I think it's important to clarify that. I'm not sure that any codified criteria would, in all circumstances, combine a moral certainty and what I'd call a compassionate utility. And we need both of those things. So it's easy to define criteria that will provide moral certainty of death. For example, a patient must have a core body temperature of less than 20 degrees C for at least a week, during which time they're held at normal room temperature. This, of course, however, is completely impractical and not sympathetic to the realities of determining whether a person has died or not. But a key element of it is the passage of time, and that's critical. The current working code of practice for the diagnosis and confirmation of death in the UK was published in 2008, and the code explicitly attempts to separate issues of death from issues of transplantation, which of course emerged in the 1960s and 70s. And it also contains criteria for the determination of death after cardiorespiratory arrest. We might call this more regular death. And that includes waiting for a period of time, 5 minutes or even longer, as being a key part of that process. Now, I think determination of death conducted in this way would provide for me a moral certainty, but of course it wouldn't necessarily leave a body that is well suited for providing certain organs for transplantation. However, I think at the heart of the confusion of the UK criteria is the so-called definition of death that is offered. And this comes from the 2008 code, which was, it was originally stated in 1995. And that is, it's the irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness combined with the irreversible loss of the capacity to breathe. Now, it seems to me that it's patently obvious that someone who requires lifelong artificial assistance to breathe is not necessarily dead. Some of these patients will be able to tell you that they are in fact alive, despite fulfilling half of the definition. And in addition, again, this is straight from the code, it's clear that the irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness does not by itself entail individual death. Patients in the vegetative state have also lost this capacity. And that is because these patients will retain brainstem function and thus would not be diagnosed as dead using the current neurological criteria and tests. So what do we say about the patient who requires ventilation during life, but then suffers a higher brain injury to render them vegetative? They would fulfill the definition of death, irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness and irreversible loss of the capacity to breathe, but they would not fulfill the diagnostic criteria. That is to say, they would retain brainstem function. So it seems to me there's a conceptual confusion at the heart of the very particular UK criteria for the diagnosis of death. And really, until this is addressed, I don't think any practical or sympathetic criteria can be established with perhaps a moral certainty.
So would you say nice criteria, shame about the definition?
I would say that, I would certainly say the definition is terribly confused in the way it works out. The criteria which relate to the determination of death are of course measuring brainstem reflexes. And as far as they go, in all honesty, I quite like the description which was given in the original 1976 account. And that was essentially to say that fulfillment of these criteria would give confidence that the patient has no meaningful chance of any form of recovery. And I think it's important when discussing these issues to realize that someone like Archie Battersbee is very, very severely injured. and I think based on what I've seen is very, very unlikely to recover. But this feeds into the question that you will have, David. It's not a question of, is it reasonable to withdraw the treatment? Because it can be reasonable to withdraw treatment for someone who is alive. There's a confusion, I think, in the two questions. When is it reasonable to withdraw treatment? And when can we state with certainty that someone is dead? And of course, the judgment, which has caused some of the confusion in the Battersbee case, was the family division court judge basically gave us two scenarios. One is that in her view, Archie was probably dead, and therefore there can be no problem with withdrawing the treatment. But then she also stated that even if he isn't dead, I still think it's in his best interest to withdraw the treatment. So whichever way you look at it, I think you should withdraw the treatment. And of course, that caused a bit of a furore. And I wonder whether that's actually what provokes the question, because we have this idea that on the balance of probabilities, Archie is dead. Of course, the subsequent Court of Appeal has said that they proceeded with their deliberations very much under the sort of condition of thinking that Archie was alive. In other words, they approached it from a best interest perspective. And maybe you will talk a little bit more about that yourself.
I would. You have anything to say, Pierre or Chris?
On the point about definitions, do you have any worries about people who are bioethicists who are suggesting that we should do away with a definition, because clearly somebody isn't dead when you are doing organ transplantation?
Well, I think it's very hard to do away with definitions because, I mean, my background is as a vet, and vets have to determine whether animals are alive or dead. And actually, there are circumstances with certain types of animal, it's really hard to tell whether something is alive or dead. It seems very obvious to us, and under most circumstances it is. And I think that inevitably you end up asking the question, well, what makes me think that they are dead? And one would use brainstem reflexes, and one would look for a heartbeat, and one would look for a body that is gradually perhaps changing. So I don't think I'd want to sort of try to completely eliminate the notion of definitions, but I think as with any definition, it needs to be sort of understood in certain contexts, and there's always circumstances in which perhaps it doesn't sort of fit quite so well, but I still think they can be useful. And in terms of a practical approach to determining death, I still think that is very useful and necessary. And in all honesty, I think in many ways it's the transplantation issue that has highlighted this problem. But prior to the transplantation being an issue, you still get these occasional cases of people being diagnosed as dead, and they miraculously wake up in their coffin. And I suspect that wouldn't happen now, because I think doctors would be much, much better at really pinning down whether someone has died and being aware of the circumstances where that might go wrong. The real issue is one of this conflict of definition and the provision of a supply of organs. Where that's not a problem, the definition of death is not a problem.
And would you say that the American definition, that's kind of a whole brain death, is better than the brain stem death?
I think it could perhaps eliminate some of the conceptual confusion, but I'm not sure it's necessarily that much better. And in this sense, I think, I'm sympathetic to your question about, the utility of the definition. But I think what you're trying to do, the risk is people are trying to wrap up the whole topic in a succinct definition, and it's very rare that is going to be universally applicable and useful when you let it out of the philosopher's room and you actually find yourself under the real life circumstances that we come. This is why these cases keep emerging, I think.
I'm totally with you about time. From my point of view, it is time. You should be leaving people, saying your prayers and all the rest of it. So yeah, I think it's only that sort of transplantation issue that is the main problem.